Mr. Kinley has taken off a couple weeks for the holidays. Good evening. I'm the host, Diana Longrie. Thank you for tuning in. Now this evening, speechless, we are coming to you from the SPNN studios in St. Paul. We are going to be talking about an investigative report that has been done by a organization called Put Your Hands Together Productions. Now you may have seen some of our news programs on these channels in replay. You've maybe watched Off the Record News, Local News Live, and the Citizens Reporter. These are all productions of Put Your Hands Together Productions Incorporated. And we have, as a group of volunteers, come together to do investigative reporting on what is going on in our local municipal governments and other governmental bodies in the metro area. Now recently it came to my attention that the Ramsey Conservation District had not been meeting for quite some time, for many months in fact, and that there was rumblings that perhaps there was some internal issues that had occurred, and that maybe one of the supervisors, one of the elected supervisors, had actually resigned from the board. However, there was very little press on any of this. Neither was the open seat put up for election. In order to find out more about what was going on with the Ramsey Conservation District, Put Your Hands Together Productions, we submitted a data practices request to the management of the Ramsey Conservation District. Now, for those of you who may have not really done a data practices request to a governmental body, let me tell you first of all a little bit about it, so that way perhaps this is a tool that you too can use if you have a question about what is going on in your government or your community around you. Minnesota has, under Chapter 13, it has what is commonly called the Data Practices Act. And this is a way that residents of the community, that they can get information from the government. And you simply put together a request that says what type of data you are seeking. Now keep in mind, many times people will say, I want this, that, and the other thing. Under the Data Practices Act, should you not know for sure if you want to actually have a copy of something, because keep in mind, you could be charged a reasonable fee for those copies. But let's say that you want to find out some information before you actually get the copies. You can request to only view the information, the data, before you decide that you want to obtain and purchase those copies. And it is important to say what period of time that you are speaking about, exactly what data that you are looking for, and to be as clear as you can be without being too specific that you actually eliminate data from your request that may actually be responsive to what you're seeking. The other way, you also don't want to be too broad, because if you are too broad in your request, well then you will have a harder time in getting the data back from the governmental entity, because they may not know exactly what you're searching for. Your request may be too large. There may be a lot of other issues, and they do have the right to come back and ask you to clarify what exactly you are looking for. So I have brought with me this evening the data practice request that I submitted to the Ramsey Conservation District. And this gives you a good example of a data practices request, because keep in mind, I wanted to find out what was going on between the various supervisors, and did somebody resign or not? What was being done? And what other kinds of information was being handled by the supervisors and their management staff? And I also wanted to know whether or not if there were violations of the open meeting law by having supervisors conducting meetings via email. Okay, so here's the data practices request that I had. Dear Miss White Eagle, I am writing to you as the responsible authority, and that's the name of the person, the position that they're designated under the law, a responsible authority. They're the one in charge of fulfilling the request. The responsible authority of the Ramsey Conservation District. This is a formal request for access to government data under the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act, Minnesota Statutes Chapter 13. If there is a designee to whom I should direct my data request different from yourself, please inform me. I seek access to the following: all data that is from, to, between, carbon copied, blind copied, or otherwise documents communications of Supervisor Paul Gardner, Supervisor Mara Humphrey, and or Supervisor Gwen Willems for the period of January 1st, 2017 to today's date. Now that date was June 9th, 2017. This request includes, but is not limited to, any and all data contained in letters, emails, text messages, notes, reports, meeting minutes, telephone call records, etc., which are maintained by the Ramsey Conservation District. I am asking to inspect the data under Minnesota Statute Section 1303, Subdivision 3. Once I have completed my inspection, I may ask to have particular items printed. Please send me your fee schedule for printed data. If you determine that you will redact or withhold any otherwise responsive data, please inform me in writing of the specific statutory basis for your denial. If you have any questions or need clarification, please contact me. And then I gave that information on how they could contact me. So the reason that I've had it worded like this is that, one, as you heard, that if for some reason they need to clarify what my request is, they have the right, the government has the right to do that. Now, I also indicated that these various emails or notes or whatever, that it's not just the things that are in the inbox. Because keep in mind, emails sometimes end up in the delete box and maybe the junk box. And maybe you might find exactly what you're looking for in somebody's trash, their electronic trash. And keep in mind, I've also got on here too that that issue that I mentioned before about I wanted to inspect the data, and I requested the fee schedule so that I know if I'm going to ask for copies of items, you know, what exactly is that going to cost me? Now, typically it is customary that in a regular request that the governmental entity that is having the request presented to them, that they have certainly 10 business days in order to fulfill that request. Now, many will fulfill that request sooner. I've had in many instances where they'll do it just, you know, the next day. Then I've had instances where maybe they've taken a little bit longer, but maybe the request was a little bit longer. And this particular request while the initial response to it was very rapid, the end result of actually getting the data was a little bit longer than those 10 business days. And I would say it was probably closer to more like about 25 business days. But we were communicating back and forth several times during that period of time. Now, I will mention that you heard in my letter, that my request, that I mentioned that if they were going to redact or withhold information, to let me know what that was and what is the basis for the redaction or for withholding the information. Because again, under the state statute, they can withhold certain data. They can also redact certain data, depending upon if it's private or confidential, or if it's attorney-client privileged, or there's a couple of other different categories as well that can be kept from the public. But when they go to redact those emails or that data, or if they want to withhold it, they have to tell you that they've done so and what is the basis for that, so that if you want to challenge it, you can challenge it. Most people do not, but sometimes you feel like you do want to challenge it when you get an email back where the whole thing has been redacted and it's all black. Now, I've had a few of those, and I know not every single word is confidential, attorney-client privilege, or, well, you know, something that can be redacted. So it gives you an idea. Now, in this example, there were some emails where initially I was told that they would be withheld and that they were consulting with their attorney about it, and that they believed that these particular batch of emails, because they were between supervisors, that they could be withheld. And my response was that I do not believe that their reason that they gave for them being withheld was a legitimate reason. And then I believe that in one instance I actually had an advisory opinion from IPAD, which is a state agency that can assist you in data practices requests, that such data was indeed public data. And lo and behold, those emails were produced. Now, why was this important to find out what was going on? Certainly, if you have an elected board of officers, in this case they're called supervisors, and they're throughout all of Ramsey County, each one represents their own district, that certainly if there's going to be a vacancy on the board, the residents of the county should certainly know that there is a vacancy, because according to the bylaws of the Ramsey Conservation District, if there's a vacancy, there are procedures to go through in order to fill that vacancy. Because you see, what it means is that those residents of that particular district, if they are without a supervisor, they are without representation. And it was my belief that the residents were never informed that their supervisor, their elected official to this board, had resigned. Now, who ever heard of such a thing? Well, it happened. Now, when I received my data practices requests, and the response to it, I received the information on a CD. So that's a very common way for governmental entities to provide that data to you should you request it. So I've got my little CD, which then I went through and I looked through and was going through much of it. Some of it was the same type of material that you would find on their website, like their minutes, their agendas, some of the packing information. But what I was really interested in was what were they saying in their emails. Well, I found a number of emails that were right on target. And I do want to mention too that it is important that if you do a data practices request and you're specifically asking about emails, to make sure that you word your request in such a way that it will include a request for the responsible authority to search through the deleted box as well as the inbox. But you might want to also include the draft box. Those emails where somebody started writing something, but then they never sent it, because that too can give you maybe an inside view as to what is going on. And there were a number of the emails that I received that there was an indication on the email that indeed it was in a deleted box. So, like I say, it can be valuable. Now, one of the emails that I have here, it talks about one of the supervisors has done some revisions to the bylaws of the Ramsey Conservation District. And he has sent the attachment along to the board chair, Mara Humphrey, and this is dated March 27th, 2017. And so the supervisors were to send in their various proposed revisions to the bylaws. Now, from what I can tell, there were a lot of different revisions going back and forth between a number of the different supervisors. However, it does not appear that a final draft was actually voted on and adopted. So from my analysis of looking at their bylaws, it is actually unclear as to which version of the bylaws is their actual set that they should be operating under. Now, while there aren't many changes and revisions made from one version to the next, or from the one that's back in 2010, there are one or two significant changes, one having to do with the how their per diem for the supervisor is paid. Because the supervisors on the Ramsey Conservation District, they do not get a salary like a city council member does. They do not get a salary like a county commissioner does. They do not get a salary like many school board members do. They get a per diem. So that based upon whatever number of meetings they go to, they get paid a flat sum of a small stipend to cover gas mileage to go to their meetings. And the state law sets forth what it is to be, but their bylaws have changed that to basically eliminate the value of any type of per diem to the supervisors. In essence, it is a deterrent to not attending very many meetings, because if you aren't paid for your mileage, it's as if you're actually doing a volunteer job, and so that will actually work as a detriment to many supervisors, where they would say, well, if I'm not getting my per diem, I can't afford to just drive to these different meetings that I should attend at the various cities where I'm the representative for that district, for the conservation district, and then you don't have the representation that the residents are expecting they should have. But let's take a look at this email that I was referring to back in March 27, 2017. As I mentioned, the one supervisor, Paul Gartner, he did his revisions. He sent them in to the chair, Mara Humphrey, and that seems rather, typical. what you would expect with a business transaction. But then the next day, he sends another email. And this email is dated March 28th, 2017. It's addressed to Mara Humphrey, the chair of the Board of Supervisors, CC to Ann White Eagle, who is the manager, the paid manager of the Conservation District. And the subject is resignation. This email says, I am attaching my resignation from the board. I'm also attaching the file, the electronic file, for the edits of the bylaws, Paul Gartner. And attached to this is indeed his signed letter of resignation, right here. This is what it says. Effective March 31st, 2017, I am resigning my seat on the Ramsey Conservation District Board of Supervisors. As a parent of a child now in college and of another child soon to be in college, maximizing my billable hours for my work is now my highest priority. Work travel requirements have increased, causing me to miss district meetings, events, and meetings of other entities like Watershed District Citizen Advisory Committees. In addition, my participation in the Master Water Stewards Program is increasing as we approach the beginning of our capstone projects, which will take many volunteer hours for the next 18 months. This is an area where I can make a substantial long-term impact on storm water management in Ramsey County. Finally, it is now clear that conflicts within the board and between board members and staff will require many additional hours of time to achieve reconciliation or some other resolution. This is time I do not have, and it would be better to have an appointed replacement who can dedicate the necessary effort. Now, this is signed, as I indicated, by Paul Gartner, and he lives in Shoreview. So, as of March 31st, when this was effective, the residents of Shoreview no longer had a representative. Now, according to the bylaws, that the supervisor who wishes to resign from the board shall submit their resignation in writing to the Ramsey Conservation District Board. And you notice that this email was indeed addressed to not only Mara Humphreys, the chair of the board, but also to the paid administrator of the board. With it being sent to the paid administrator of the board, I would say that it is being presented to the board as a body, because she is indeed the person who runs the day-to-day affairs of the board, and certainly had the responsibility of bringing it forward as the paid administrator to the rest of the board. And Mara Humphreys, as the chair of the board, likewise had similar responsibilities. Now, it says in their bylaws that if there is a vacancy, that depending upon how much time between the vacancy when it occurs and the next election, it says whether or not if there's an appointment or whether or not there's a special election. Now, And I'm looking at the bylaws here, and it says, if a vacancy occurs more than 56 days before the next state primary election, the board shall fill the vacancy by appointment. If the vacancy occurs less than 56 days before the next state primary election, the board shall fill the vacancy by appointment in accordance with the Minnesota statutes, and then it gives the statute. So that's the procedure for taking care of a vacancy. As it turned out, neither the paid administrator, Ann White Eagle, or the chair of the board, Mara Humphreys, presented the resignation to the board or put it on the agenda for it to be part of the meeting discussion to say we need to call for people to put in their interest if they want to be appointed, or whatever process they would use for appointment. I mean, that's what the board would have to figure out. How are we going to do this appointment? But that was never done. Instead, it's interesting about the stalling that you see when you look through the emails. That shortly after receiving this, Mara Humphreys sends an email to Ann White Eagle, and she says, FYI, told Paul I'm not accepting his resignation until we talk. Since when does she have the authority to accept or not accept a resignation of a supervisor who has duly submitted his resignation to the board by giving it to the paid administrative staff in charge of the Conservation District? And then she continues on with, there's an email then to her email to Paul where she says, where Mara Humphrey says to Paul, Paul, give me a call, please call me on my cell phone, and then gives her number. And he says, I'm just too angry right now to have a rational discussion. Give me a few days. Wow. That sounds like somebody who was glad they resigned. Another email that I think is pertinent to this whole issue of stalling. This is now in April 28th. A whole month has gone by. The board has had a meeting. Paul Gartner wasn't there. The members, the supervisors were told, well, we're going to notify Ramsey County that there's been a resignation. So they do that. But again, it is still not on the agenda so that the board, as a full board of supervisors, can discuss how are they going to go about making an appointment for the vacancy. And yet, the minority supervisors, because the board is a split board, and now with a vacancy, it's basically a vote of 2 to 2. The two that are not on the side with Mara Humphreys are assured it's going to be on the agenda the next meeting. Well, the next meeting for the next month doesn't occur. The next meeting after that, because keep in mind, they only have a meeting once a month. The next meeting after that doesn't occur. And then it's July. They have an important meeting with some financial information that needs to be approved by the board. Unfortunately, one of the supervisors is going to be gone on vacation. And so they decide they can't change the date of the meeting. And instead, they hold the meeting instead. But in July, who should happen to come back to the board and resume his spot, but none other than Paul Gartner. He then votes to pass these financial matters after he's already resigned and he's never been reappointed, and there's no real explanation as to why he is able to continue on as a supervisor during that meeting, making decisions at all. Now, this last email I wanted to share with you is April 28th, 2017. This now is again an email between Mara Humphreys and Paul Gartner, where Mara Humphreys is still busy trying to connect up with Paul Gartner and have that cup of coffee and talk to him. And this is the email where they make those arrangements. Okay, now I understand that I have a caller on the line. Since this is a live call-in show, I'm happy to have a caller. Let's get them to the table. Thank you, caller. Questions or comments?
Diana.
Hello.
Diana, thank you for doing this show. There's very little information on the Ramsey County Conservation District, and it's a significant board, and they are elected officials. Thanks for doing this show on the collusion or finagling that's going on behind the scenes. I know we are not able to see that in the commercial media, so this really adds something to how government in Ramsey County, at least, and in Minnesota, I guess, actually works, or doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, and something that I didn't mention to the viewers that I think is pertinent part of this conversation is that, you see, the Ramsey Conservation District, they are not a taxing authority. They receive their funding through Ramsey County, and so that's one of the reasons why Ramsey County had to be notified of the resignation, because that's where, well, that's where part of their funding comes from. They have to submit their budget to the Ramsey County for not necessarily approval, but so that it is part of what Ramsey County has a review of, even though the Ramsey Conservation District is considered a state office under the state statutes. So it's kind of an interesting little body of government, and generally speaking, what their purpose is to help residents with, like, say, groundwater issues, the sealing of their wells, knowing and understanding about how perhaps like rain gardens can be used effectively on a person's property. They have some cost sharing programs. There's a lot of good value that the Ramsey Conservation District has, but somewhere along the way, a number of the supervisors have lost sight of what their purpose is in being on this board. And that's why we felt it was important to investigate this rumor that we heard that one of the supervisors had resigned and that there was an active effort to not reappoint somebody to that position.
And this is fascinating, because it sounds like there was more than just not finding a reappointment or dragging their feet or undoing a reappointment or even reappointing them in the end, but it is actually was revoking somebody's resignation, trying to revoke somebody's resignation who didn't want it to be, who had submitted their resignation, or leaving the seat blank.
And in many ways, it seemed to me like it was an effort to make the board even more dysfunctional, and then to blame it on the two supervisors who were seeking to, one, have a statement of equity incorporated within the mission statement of the district, or the minority that wanted to rectify what was going on with the per diem that the supervisors are supposed to be getting under state law that has been basically relegated to little or nothing under the bylaws, and that there's this internal struggle between different philosophies that they couldn't, they figured the way that they could regain that power over the minority, those supervisors in the minority, was to simply hold this spot open, because then there would always be a stalemate. And you see, when there's always going to be a stalemate, you know for sure that nothing will ever get done. And keep in mind, over in Hennepin County, a few years back, there was a push to eliminate the Hennepin County Conservation District. And some believe that this is an effort in the Ramsey Conservation District to cause this ongoing stalemate so that it can be pointed to as dysfunctional, so it too can be disbanded.
And of course, it sounds as if boards, conservation districts are very applicable today when younger people are trying to return to the older ways of a couple generations ago, where they try to care for the soil, try to care for sustainable practices, and most importantly, try to really protect and preserve the groundwater. Mm-hmm. And of course, that is even more significant when you see the Minnesota Attorney General suing 3M because of the effect of dumping chemicals or other environmental toxins which affect the groundwater or drinking water of different communities and the soil.
Right, exactly. And I would say it was probably, if my recollection serves me, probably about 6 years ago that the Ramsey Conservation District compiled a map of Ramsey County that designated where all of the various dump sites were throughout Ramsey County, and not necessarily, I'm not talking about chemical dump sites like you were alluding to, like with, say, for instance, 3M and the chemicals that are associated with some of their production years ago. But these were dump sites that were the neighborhood dump sites, where the neighborhood decided, well, gee whiz, we want to get rid of our trash. There's that gully over there. Everybody in that neighborhood threw their trash into that gully, and that was a dump site. And so the Conservation District, they have that map of all of those dump sites, those that have been either taken care of and that there's been restoration done, or even those that they know that they exist, but nobody's actually really done anything other than just cover it over because of where it's located, like in a gully someplace where nobody's building. And so right along with what you're saying, that's part of what their mission is that protection of the groundwater and in having best practices. And that's why they've always had a successful program for sealing of wells. And it just goes together with that. But it's unfortunate that I believe that there's this undertone that has now been developing for perhaps maybe a year or two, where there's this, maybe, as I mentioned, this group of people that may think that the time for the Conservation District has come to an end. And what better way to argue that it should be disbanded than to have a district where it's always a stalemate, 2-2, or a vacancy, or that you have conflict that is being created at every single council meeting or supervisor meeting as they're trying to conduct business. And I should mention something I noticed when I was going through all the various emails over that period of time is that the paid staff, administrator, and White Eagle, that there were several times where she sent an email to only, this was before Paul Gartner resigned, that she would send an email with information only to 3 of the supervisors and not the other 2. And that's exactly what they tell you not to do in, like say for instance, a city manager school, that you're supposed to treat everybody that's on your board the same. And I found that evidence of that one-sidedness as well.
Thank you for bringing this important issue out, because when you, in the end, when they do claim that if that is the pitch, political operatives behind the blind want to create, that this very significant and helpful board for the education and the protection of the soil and the water in Ramsey County, when this board, if somebody is to make this case that it needs to be eliminated because of dysfunction,
Okay, well that was our caller. The connection has been broken, but I want to thank our caller for calling in, and I appreciate that. Our number is on the telephone screen there, so if there's anyone else out there who would like to call in, please do so. Now, after we received our information from our data practices request, we had to wait a while before it was a meeting that was going to take place, because we wanted to go to one of their meetings and to film it so that we could cable cast that meeting. Because unfortunately, this is one of those governmental bodies that hasn't gotten to that point where they are cable casting their meetings to the residents of the county. Now, of course, they should be doing this, because if they want to make their board relevant to the people of Ramsey County, what better way than to ensure that people can watch your monthly meeting to hear the discussions of what's going on. But we were there with our camera, and we've brought with us some of the film footage. Oh, and you know what? I understand that our caller is back on the line. So let's get our caller to the table before we get to our film footage. Caller?
And Diana, one point I was trying to make is, because of your show, we're able to get a glimpse into what maybe political operatives games are trying to play behind the scene to cause issues. They're behind the scenes, hidden from public view, hidden very inside politics, in their apparent desire to cause chaos or just cause inability to make and go forward and to move forward with decisions to help the public. And so I wanted to thank you for bringing this important collusion behind the scenes and shining some light on it, because it shows, and not only do you see it, which apparently you see it here, but this idea that of elected officials, whether it's in the U.S. Congress or if it's in the state legislature or if it's in your county board, that the group that might be not totally in sync with the majority might have a minority viewpoint on this issue or a broader issue. They do not deserve, it seems like, according to some of these political operatives, to be able to even get the information of what is being presented, much less being at the table. And we see that in the U.S. Congress, where they do, especially right at this time, where everything has been done completely in back rooms and then pulled out at the last minute.
Right.
And that kind of decision making can only cause a real dysfunction and cause hard feelings in a democracy or into your local government.
Right. And quite frankly, the Ramsey Conservation District might as well be conducting their business behind closed doors, because given the fact that they are not cable casting their meetings so that people can watch the meetings through their cable channels, the fact that we've got a supervisor who resigned in March 28th, 2017, and then miraculously, unannounced, shows up at a July meeting so that he can vote on agenda items when there wouldn't have been a quorum at that meeting. See, and that's the thing that is fascinating, is that the July meeting, if it were not for Paul Gartner deciding to just show up, there wouldn't have been a quorum at that meeting because two of the other supervisors were unavailable. One was on vacation and one was recovering from a car accident. And so conveniently, they bring Paul Gartner out, even though he is resigned. They bring him out, and he's listed in the minutes as having voted on financial issues and on passing other issues as well, that the board, quite frankly, should have continued their meeting until the other supervisors were able to attend. So when you're talking about doing things in the back room, here is a board that is doing things in the back room figuratively and practically.
And
now,
really
go ahead, caller.
What's really shocking is that because such a large component of this board sounds like public awareness and public education, it seems that the executive staff, the executive director, the paid staff of this board should be very interested in having as much information and have as many meetings of these elected officials out there on cable TV, so easy way to raise awareness on some of the most significant issues like in groundwater and the soil, when it's clear that the general commercial media doesn't cover this.
And I want to mention that, you know, I talked about how Paul Gartner showed up at a July meeting. The next meeting that they held, even though they're supposed to have a meeting every single month, the next meeting that was held was not until October 2017. And that's the meeting that we have our film footage of. So caller, I think we're going to switch over now and we're going to show some of our film footage. But I want to thank you for calling in.
Thank you for doing this important show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's take a look. We're going to start with the beginning of the meeting so that you have a flavor for how the meetings start, and we will cut in and out so that way I can give you commentary along the way. Let's take a look.
Okay, well my phone says 6:30, so I will go up ahead and call our October board meeting to order. Is there a motion to approve the agenda? So moved. Is there a second?
Madam Chair, I do have a few items.
supervisor votes.
I would like, under the consent agenda items, I would like the following items removed for discussion. A, D, E, and G.
Okay.
And then I wanted to add my data practices request.
To the agenda.
Right.
Okay, let's add all those under item G and then data practices. Okay, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, motion carries. Announcements. Any announcements? Ann?
Today we received the annual announcement for the annual meeting, and I was just going to pass out the registration form and the agenda for the MASWC meeting in December. And I don't know if people already know if they're interested, but we have in the past.
Now I'm going to break in here briefly. You notice how at the beginning there were the 4 supervisors, and then at the last minute, right before the meeting's going to start, Mr. Paul Gartner shows up again. Shows up so that it's just right when the meeting's going to start, so nobody can question why he is there October 2017 when he resigned and handed in his resignation, signed resignation no less, on March 28th, 2017. The lady in the pink shirt is Mara Humphreys. And then when you saw the 2 ladies on the far right, those are the 2 supervisors that are in the minority who have the questions that need to be answered. And they're the ones who are being shut down. Lena Buggs and Margaret Behrens. Let's continue on with our film footage.
Approve that as a special meeting. And approved expenses for anyone interested.
Okay, I'd like to make a motion to approve it as a special meeting. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, motion carries. Any other announcements? Okay. Any public comments? Yes, ma'am. You have 3 minutes.
Do I stand here or you want me to stand somewhere else?
That would be perfect, unless you want to get yourself on camera.
No, that's okay. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for having a public comment. I really appreciate that. I think this is the first time that I've come to the meeting to give comments. I'm Diana Longrie, and I live in Maplewood. I'm a local attorney, but I'm also the executive producer of Put Your Hands Together Productions and the chief editor of our news programs, Off the Record News, Local News Live, and the Citizens Reporter. And we do weekly news programs. So our focus is on local, municipal, public policy, and other governmental affairs. And so typically we like to take a look at different governing bodies and what they do. And as you're aware, we recently did a data practices request so that we could understand a couple of questions that we had after looking at some of the various minutes and stuff, because your meetings are not cable cast, so we're not able to see really what what's going on. Although I know you're doing good work, I don't know what you're doing. So, and I've done a few programs in the past on the Soil and Conservation District as well. But in looking at the data practices, I came across something that I thought, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it, and certainly looked like a news program to me. Certainly a news story that we're going to be cable casting. But I came across March 28th an email where there was the resignation of Supervisor Paul Gartner, and attached to it was also his letter of resignation dated March 28th. It was not a contingent resignation, and according to the statutes that I'm looking at, that it's effective upon being received by an officer or the body or the board, and it looks to me like it was certainly received by the chief officer. So it appears to me to be effective. And then when I was looking then at the minutes getting prepared for tonight's meeting, I noticed that Mr. Gartner had been at the July. And we are coming to the end of our program, but something fascinating occurred as I got finished up with my comments and my questions, in that it was discovered that neither Supervisor Lena Buggs or Supervisor Margaret Behrens had ever seen a copy of the letter of resignation of Paul Gardner. They had never seen it. They had heard it existed, but they had never had it shared with them. They actually asked if they could have a copy of it, and they were informed that if they wanted a copy of it, they could do a data practices request if they wanted to get a copy of it, or that they could get it from Miss Longrie, since it appeared that Miss Longrie had a copy of it. That was the type of response that those two supervisors received when they questioned if they could have this public document that certainly has something to do with the business of the Ramsey Conservation District. Now, we are hoping that in our next program that we will be able to have them on our program to give you more information and insight. And certainly we will have more clips as well to show you the hubbub that happened at the meeting. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Go by like the forest sets on fire, and the wind takes the kite as the firefly brings the light.